This morning, what I would like to do is to use our time to look at a few issues which we need to think about before we get into first a phenomenology of masculine images of the divine. That is to say, and you can begin cribbing for your test now, because in just a few minutes, I'm going to ask you to tell me gods that stand out to you as historical, powerful images, masculine images of the divine, and to say just briefly what you associate with them. What energies, and some of you have studied Jean Boland's excellent work on this, and so you can draw on that, but there are many traditions that you know about, and so we can get beyond just the Greek tradition, too. But anyway, be thinking about that. If you get bored with what I'm saying, just switch over into your memory banks and see if you can pick up some masculine God images that reflect energies in masculine spirituality, and we'll give you a chance to bring those to the group in a few minutes. But what I propose to do is to talk a little bit about the complex issues that you get into when you start thinking about images of the divine in general, and especially when you start talking about any gender-oriented images of the divine. Because this is a hot potato and has been for a long time. And I want to just lift up a few of the reasons why that's so controversial, and why when you bring in Jungian psychology and Jungian assumptions about the psyche and Jungian assumptions about psychology and religion, why that complexifies it even more. And then I will just say a little bit about why I think Jung's work, particularly the understanding of the richness of the human archetypal imagery that is in the deep psyche, why the understanding of that and the what we believe to be the reality of the objective psyche, the archetypal psyche, the collective unconscious, is important to understanding why all the hullabaloo is going on. And also why I and many others do not believe that you get anywhere for human beings to take gender out of images of God. So I'm going to argue vigorously against all those people who think you can get beyond the sex of God. And there are many people that believe you can. Or beyond the sex of the goddess, so that we just have a neutered divinity. So I want to start out with that. Then I want us to do our phenomenology, in which we at least honor Jean Boland's work on the images of the divine. And that ought to get us to the break. If we get too into that, somebody remind us we should take a break about 11. And then after our break, we'll come back, and then I'm going to shamelessly tell you what I think about this. Okay? All right. All right. Now let's talk a little bit about this whole thing of images of the divine. This has been enormously controversial in human history. And depending on what tradition you're in, you have a radically different point of view about this. And I don't mean just what Christian tradition you're in, although I do mean that. If you're a Muslim, you have certain assumptions about images in the divine, images of any kind in the divine. If you're a Jew, you have certain images, attitudes about that. If you're a Hindu, you have radically different attitudes about the role and value of images. If you're a neo-pagan and a practitioner of Wicca, it's witchcraft. The craft, my pagan friends say. The craft, by which they mean goddess religions, or at least they mean the practice of magic, M-A-G-I-C-K, magic, which they distinguish from stage magic, which is M-A-G-I-C in their view, yeah.
By using the term pagan,
yes,
isn't that a differentiation?
Well, I don't know. That she says by using the term pagan, isn't that a patriarchal designation? Well, that's an interesting question, and it's one that those should be referred to all my witch friends who do not believe that pagan is at all patriarchal. They think it is the most inclusive, actually pro-feminist point of view and thing to be designated. And in fact, it's very interesting. We don't have the time today to spend any time on this, but neo-paganism is the single fastest growing religious phenomenon in the United States, and they're studying the phenomenology of it around the world. And it is highly valuing of the religion of the goddess, at least, whatever else you say about it. And so I don't know. That's an interesting question you should ask the leaders in those movements. But anyway, the point I'm making, I'm not advocating any of these things at this point. I'm just reflecting about the theory of the imagination, which is what we're talking about here. Everybody has different theories of the imagination. Remember, those of you that were here when I was speaking earlier this week, there's not one theory of the imagination. There are all these theories of the imagination, and every religious tradition and every sub-tradition within a given religion has a different theory of the imagination. And you have to get a sense of what the theory of the imagination is before you have a sense of what they think about images, because what you think about image depends on what you think about the imagination, and what you think about the imagination is grounded on what you think the plumbing is in the human personality and soul. And everybody's all over the place on that. They don't agree on that. So just to start out with, we need to understand that human beings have been killing each other about this topic for aeons, and are today. And there is very little evidence that human beings are getting any wiser on this topic whatsoever. In contemporary India, what they call communalism, which is an interesting designation, communalism, by which they mean the tendencies in Indian culture to split around this issue and kill each other. See? So we need to be aware of the historical situation and the contemporary situation, because the attitudes toward image and whether my image is better than yours, and whether my image is true and yours is false, my image is right and yours is heretical, etc., etc., and this is a favorite human pastime. And historically they have loved killing you about this issue more than any other issue. They'll kill you about anything, but you have more enthusiasm on this one, the Crusades, those that like to attack this warrior archetypal energy in human beings always point out the way that it gets recruited into the service of bigotry, religious bigotry. And it sure has in the past. Still is today. Some of us think that could be changed. Others are not hopeful at all. But that's the context for this discussion. And it's the widest context, but it is enormously political, and rightfully so. Because if we don't get some wisdom on this business, something is likely to happen. And here's what it is. Every fundamentalist group with a certain attitude about images and a certain belief about how you ought to relate to those images is getting the nuclear bomb now. All these people that think the threat of nuclear war is over are totally into massive denial, because it does not comfort me to think that now the Kremlin is gradually losing its hold on its nuclear stockpiles to tribal groups that would like to kill you because you think that using an image of God makes you an infidel that ought to be offed by any means possible, including enriched uranium and plutonium. So this is not an abstract academic issue that doesn't relate to anything. This relates to your grandchildren's life or death. And so that's the wider context. Now let's get into the other historical cultural context that challenges us. I mean, the problem about, I don't know why you got interested in this Jungian stuff, because it really, if you start messing with it, it gets you into all this work. Because all these other schools of psychology have got the fantasy that they can become a responsible, educated psychologist without knowing anything about culture. They've lately decided that they ought to have a course in a doctoral program in psychology on culture and psychology. They also have one on culture or psychology and religion. That's going to prepare the psychotherapist, right? One course, 3-hour course. But in any case, if you start messing around with this Jungian stuff, then you're signing on to start studying cross-cultural traditions all over the world, because you can't get down into archetypal stuff without doing it, because that's your research base. So when you're hot and tired on a summer afternoon, I hate to bring you this news, but you just signed on for a long haul here. It's going to take the rest of your life. You're going to, when you die, you're probably going to have a comparative mythology book on your desk. Sorry about that. Join the club. See, you already have. Oh, that's the problem. Now the rest of you, from now on, you're going to go to the Adler Institute, and they won't bother you with this stuff. Okay, but we have to look at the history of culture on this stuff, and the way in which so much of the political and ethical things that concern us today are grounded in image, the power of image. Power of myth, right? Campbell's book, The Power of Myth, right. But what is myth? It is narrative presentations of numinous images. That's what it is. So when you're talking about comparative mythology, you're talking about comparative systems of image and symbol. And the thing that makes it so politically and ethically potent and loaded is that the history of, we've been talking about intergroup violence, but today in our society, the the way in which these images have been struggled about for political power between the genders. And if you have, how many of you have seen this volume by Gimbutas, which is on the history of images? That's an important book. You got to look at that. Gimbutas. I don't know whether we have it here today. We should have it here. Was there? It's the language of the goddess. Gimbutas. This is a female anthropologist, archaeologist, who has been doing a lot of study in Eastern European goddess traditions, unearthing a lot of the imagery that patriarchal spiritual traditions sought to destroy, and didn't succeed quite. They almost succeeded. But what she's done is unearthed so much of the goddess imagery, which it lies below the patriarchal traditions of, particularly, she's an Eastern European and has done a lot of work there, see. So, in scholarship today, so much scholarship is going into trying to retrieve all of these female images of the divine. What's been happening? Well, it is, all this stuff is political. Has to do with power. Has to do with how you use images to sanction power. How you use images to sanction empowerment. And what you are sanctioning empowerment of. So what I'm setting us up now, this is the theoretical take that I'm setting up for our discussion of all of these things, images we're looking at today, and in terms of what I've been trying to do, along with my work with Douglas Gillette in these series of books we've been working on, and also in this Paulist Press series on Jung and world spirituality, because we are in a situation in which there has been very little consciousness about the politics of images, consciousness about it, and about the way that this operates in masculine and feminine psychology and in politics. See? And we're getting more conscious now, but we have a long way to go before we get out of sort of a shoot from the hip mentality about this, quick draw, without much practice. And a lot of things get shot up, and a lot of people get shot up, and there's a lot of smoke and light and everything, but there's not a lot of wisdom, in my view, about this. So our job today is to look at this issue and looking at masculine and feminine images. And what I'm going to argue is that if you take Jung's work seriously, theoretically, you don't just take Jung, but you take a paradigm that he developed, and you look at those fundamental assumptions that he had about the pleroma inside, the pleroma, the fullness in your hardwiring, and we start teasing out the implications of that, so that we can see the incredible richness of images of the divine in human experience, and we can talk about what is at stake in how we treat this. What is at stake for personal sanity, and what is at stake for public sanity. And before we stop, 12:30 at least, I want to have gotten all those things on the table and told you what I think about this. So that's a sense of how these things are loaded. And the final thing I want to say about how they're loaded before we get into your phenomenology on these different God images we're going to work with before the break is to reiterate very quickly that It matters which psychological set of assumptions you bring to this issue. If you are in many schools of psychology, there is no sense that there is any structure to the images that pour forth from the imagination that is grounded in your biology. There is an enormous anti-structural bias in the contemporary intellectual world on psychological issues, and particularly with regard to image. The state of psychologies of the imagination today, the non-Jungian psychologies of the imagination, is really dismal. So you won't find much attention, serious attention to this. When you find Freudian attention to it, there is a reductionistic stance toward these symbols and so forth, these symbols and images, which tends to reduce it to personal experience and tends to have a very patriarchal bias in that system of thought. You know, feminist psychologists have accused Freud and Erikson and others of writing a masculine psychology. They've written a pretty good masculine psychology in some ways, except for this area. But in any case, what we need to be aware of today is what we talked about the other day about the ego-self axis. You remember that? That is critical for discussing this issue. If you don't believe that the imagination is structured and that when you're relating to your unconscious that there is a spectrum of images that you will begin to contact that is full in itself, then your attitude toward images and images of the divine will be that you can do with them what you want and it won't matter. And let me go over it again. If you don't think that human hardwiring has in it a certain spectrum of images that are in there for a reason, then when you start messing with theology and scriptures and of any tradition, or talking about images related to spirituality or religion, then you will feel free to do anything you want to do without any reference to anything else except the current political trends. If, however, there are structures in the imagination that cover a certain spectrum, ranging from the masculine to the feminine, one has to ask why that is. As a scientist, one has to ask, wonder what that's for. And then the next kind of scientific, psychological question in the psychology of myth would be, why have human beings always come up with these mythological traditions? Now, if you're one of these psychologically illiterate professors who teach about mythology and totally out of the context of any psychological studies, then you won't be thinking about why human beings have had myth except in terms of accidental, historical, environmental, cultural reasons, political reasons. But if you're taking a scientific, psychoanalytic, psychological perspective on the deep psyche, and you say, now what has mythology perhaps got to do with this hardwiring? See, is that accidental? You know, back in the early 60s, all the theologians in the seminaries in so-called mainline denominations were saying, now what we've got to do is get rid of myth. If we just got rid of myth, it would liberate the entire human race. See? And then there's those, that's in the same group that says if we just got rid of all these images, if we just got beyond these gender-based images of God and goddess, then we'd liberate the whole human race. So they worked on that, and pretty soon there's very little talk about gender in a lot of circles of God. You get, when you go to seminary after the early 60s, you study philosophical theology, philosophy of religion. You spend no time studying images. You spend no time studying comparative mythology. You spend no time studying comparative religion because it's not important, right? Get it? And it's very interesting. In the last 30 years since 31 years since 1960, we have had an epidemic of addictions. Burgeoning epidemic of addictions. Isn't that interesting? Coincidence. See? Isn't it interesting that addictions grow as mythologies are no longer utilized? Isn't that interesting? See? Could it be that there might be some relationship between these two things? See? And so, if you're a Jungian, in terms of your understanding of there being a collective unconscious, an objective psyche, that this is not unstructured, that this is very structured, that this is a pleroma, it is full, and that within it there is the richness of the feminine, not just of passive images of the feminine, but the full, rich pleroma of images of the feminine, and also the full, rich pleroma of images of the masculine. Now that gets us to Jean Bolin. Because Jean Bolin's work, it has not been lauded as much as it really deserves. Because before her work, Jungian analysts had gotten in the habit of throwing the word archetype around, for theoretical reasons and everything, but they did not put much emphasis on the archetypal dimensions of clinical work. In other words, archetypes are an interesting concept, but they always come through complexes, and that's where you work with it in the complex and so forth. And so what we really work with is complexes, and we get the complex through the dream, and so we work with dream and complex. And after Jean Bolin came along, and she published this Goddesses in Every Woman book, people began to see that there is an enormous psychological insight in studying the mythic images. In this case, the mythic images of the feminine, presented in the form of goddesses. Then she continued her work, and she stayed with the Greek tradition, and she did a book called Gods in Every Man. And so she did what I believe is pioneering, and what I would like for us to think of as a pilot study. We should think of Bolin's work as a pilot study in world mythology, in the psychology of world mythology, because it would be a mistake to assume that the Greeks had it all whole and complete. And we can talk about that in a minute after we lay out some of these Greek gods and goddesses and so forth. But anyway, so now that gets us to a good place to talk about Bolin's book, Gods in Every Man. We ought at least get some of those gods she talked about in our discussion this morning before our break. And then we will broaden it out. Let's start with her work. What are some of the masculine images of the divine that Bolin talks about in that Gods in Every Man book? Let's just have the courage to be imperfect and skip. Name the ones that come to mind first. Hermes. Now, before we go on, let's just say a word about Hermes. What does she say? What is this divine energy imaged in the image of Hermes?
The ability to go to both worlds.
That's right. Ability to go to both worlds. Mercurial. Trickster element. The messenger. Slippery fellow, you know, right? Yes?
Throwing the sword and making love to her after the sword has been thrown.
That's complicated, John. You've been studying. He knows some things about love and war, right? But now notice, he knows some things. He doesn't go do it. He says, well, you might think about this. Sound a little bit like Merlin there, see, because it's the same kind of energy. It's the energy of insight and wisdom and connecting all sorts of things. So this energy, they say of Hermes is the god of the thresholds. Murray Stein, in his book on midlife, talks about Hermes in the context of midlife issues, when you're making big changes in your life. Okay, let's go on. We don't have enough time to spend good time on the
about the writer Boland. Am I correct that she expanded something beyond Jung's works of the archetype?
Yeah, let me just comment. I think she has gone beyond Jung's understanding of masculinity and femininity. That is, Jung and Freud were both Victorian males. And in Victorian culture, passivity was seen as more feminine, activity more masculine, and that was just the way it was. And so if a woman had aggressive energy, she was more masculine. She was seen as more masculine. And that's why a lot of classical Jungians used to say if a woman was assertive, that meant that she was coming out of her animus, or her masculine side. Boland has gone much beyond that. And so that's a revolutionary change, and it's very interesting. I will run into a lot of people around the country today. I was on the phone with somebody the other day interviewing me about the state of Jungian psychology, and this person was convinced that Jungians did not think that the feminine could be assertive or aggressive as feminine. And see, they just didn't know what year was Boland's book first published? That's been around a long time. And Jean has lectured all over the United States and much of the world. And it's interesting that people, still have not become apprised of that. But let's go on with other gods. Ares. What about Ares?
He's a physical god.
Kind of physical, right. Ares. Ever know an Ares male?
That's the only reason I couldn't finish that book. And I loved Ares because I had an old friend who was about 80 at the time and has since died, and he embodied Ares. To the nth degree, and I adored him.
Old men who are Aries, that's kind of fine to be around, but when you get around a young Aries, it's a different story.
But he didn't marry till he was in his 40s, and it was an accident.
You get that? He didn't marry. Yeah. Well, let's hear about Aries energy. Somebody just tell me quickly, what energy is in Aries? It's not just one energy in Aries. Conflict. Well, describe. Come on, a little more about Aries. This is the Greek version that later on gets expressed as Mars. He's a war god. Yeah, he's so full of passion. See, when you're so full of passion, kind of hard to keep that up. You get shattered a little bit sometimes. But he's extremely passionate. And sometimes he can't decide whether he wants to fight you or make love to you. Or he can't get straight which way he wants. And he's not real smart. See? You get it, you get in contact with this energy, it's very exciting, but you need to learn to duck. And there's a lot of this energy about, folks. I don't know if you have retreated to safe havens or what you think are safe havens in your cities and communities, but if you get out of your safe havens and you go out where the folk live, you'll find this character a lot. This character is behind a lot of the battering of women and children that goes on, and a lot of the gratuitous violence all over everywhere. And contrary to what a lot of people say, this is not the same as Mars. Mars has his act a lot more cleaned up than this. This guy is just kind of all over the place, yeah.
He was that described as a young man.
Yeah, go ahead.
But he also was a rejected son, but the only father that
Speak up so everybody can hear you, please.
He was a rejected son, but the only father who defended his children of the male temperament.
Yeah. Did you hear that? Oh, isn't that interesting? A rejected son has a little trouble controlling his aggression. Isn't that interesting? But when the time comes, that aggression can come in handy sometimes, right? Okay, let's move on. I mean, we could spend a lot of time with him and that energy. Now, you want to ask, when you're thinking about these images that she talks about, think about masculine spirituality. Think about what happens in religious traditions and images around these, the ones you know about. Because that's an energy, and it is present in more than one tradition, but it is not emphasized by some traditions. See? Okay, let's go on. Other major players here. Dionysius. What do you associate with Dionysius? If you follow Boland's kind of take on that. Ecstasy. What do you mean ecstasy? Good times. Well, yeah. What else? Flesh that out a little bit for me. Flesh that out. Give me a little more Dionysius here. Come on. You know about this. Come on, don't make out like you're in the monastery here today.
A lifetime ongoing orgasm.
Yeah, but I mean, is that just genital?
Records those experiences. That's where he's not.
No, it's very said spiritual. It's extreme. This is where your mystic has a lot. There, you know, if anybody's really a mystic, instead of just kind of signing that on their vita, you know, a lot of folks, you know, put that on their vita, on their book jacket, official mystic, you know. But somebody that's a real mystic has got a lot of this Dionysius energy. And it's because they have such a sense of the enormous beauty of all the worlds, all the textures of the surfaces, and the insides of all the worlds. And that they are so turned on by this. In the current language of self-psychology, we would say they are perpetually overstimulated. Now, again, being around a person like this is not boring. But your mother, rightfully, probably was kind of concerned if you're going to bring one home to marry. That's right. But anyway, that energy is constantly disrespectful of boundaries. The Dionysian personality is not going to be nice. And a Dionysian divinity is not going to be nice. Anything else you want to associate with Dionysius before we go? I mean, Boland does a great job of just bringing in the surround of these beings. But say more. Anything else? Yeah. Yeah. Now, he's not totally unrelated. You can relate to this person. They can form relationships. See, one of the interesting things that one needs to do in working on this pleroma, this masculine and feminine pleroma, is to think about what kind of unconscious partnerships alchemically arise between this form of the masculine psycho-spiritual energy and this form of the feminine psycho-spiritual energy. Because if you study mythology and do the kind of work you were doing right there, you will notice that there are a lot of couples that form. They don't last too long a lot of the time, but couples form. You know, Mars has an affair with Aphrodite. Doesn't last, of course. But, see, one of the things you want to think about, and this is our problem, see, this is the bad news. Bad news is that in your unconscious are all these energies and structures, and there are some natural kinds of ready, easy affinities. Read that unconscious, archaic affinities. That, shall we say, are not individuated affinities because of the lack of consciousness. They're ready. It's kind of like, you know, an alchemical attraction or chemical bonding. You know, across the crowded room, suddenly, bing! Well, that's probably one of these archaic affinities. See? Some figure in your psyche has gotten a gleam in its eye. See? And so we can go on and on with these, and that's one rich field of study. Somebody's working on some dissertations or something here. You know, the whole study, Gene Boland and I were talking about this the other day. We're going to do an event in the winter about inner couples. And we're going to look at these kind of quick, unconscious inner couples, and we're going to try to talk about the problems that causes, and then try to look at what possibilities might exist for a little more conscious relationship to the inner couples. Anyway, so let's get a few more of these major players in. Orpheus. And what do you associate with Orpheus? Music. Well, he's a mythical figure. I mean, you could, you know, it's not one of the big, this is not one of the ones that Boland lifts up and features, but it is an energy. And if you want to relate that, see, I was wondering if anybody would relate Dionysian energy to music, because Dionysius is related to music and that energy that you see in Orpheus there. If you go to a rock concert, you can see the relationship between Dionysius and this sort of Orpheus thing. Nobody has mentioned Zeus. Yes, well, let's do Zeus, and then let's do Apollo. I mean, let's do the king of the mountain here, and let's hear what about him. What about Zeus energy? Lee Roloff has got great lectures on Zeus energy. Well, in what sense? All these are patriarchal in some sense. These are all, you know, patriarchal. They are rule of masculine images. But now, he is what? He's sire. That means that he is sort of the generator. Right. See, here is a creator God, creation image. What else about Zeus? Okay. Tends to be a little jealous of any. Tends to be a little jealous of power, right? Just a little bit. Intends to rule. Period. This is what Theodore Milan would. This is sort of the archetypal image or the divine image between the active, independent personality. I intend to rule. I intend to do what I intend to do. Period. Now, what else would you say about Zeus?
Possesses any woman he wants.
That's right. Why?
And he's always above the rules. I mean, any rule would apply to anyone else.
He's above the rules.
Totally.
See, that's your sociopathic dimension in this energy in the masculine. That is, he's a rule breaker. Why is he a rule breaker? He is the creator. I am above the law, you see. Now, why is it that he feels that he has the right to any woman that he wants?
That's just what kings feel like.
Yeah, in that image. The archetypal king is the creator of all, and, you know, it's that image behind the body of Christ. All the world is my body. I and the world are one. And that includes all of you. So just because I want to play with myself, don't get upset. See? That's the narcissistic personality disorder, literally. See, when you've got a really severe narcissistic personality disorder, they're not two people. It's only I. I include all. I don't need any empathy. There's no such thing as relationship. And if I choose to play with any of my body, it's my business. One of the traits of narcissism, grandiosity, pathological grandiosity, is that I assume no need for any empathy because I am the surround. Now this is John's brought up the king, and he says this is an image of the king. Well, right, it's an image of the shadow king. If you want to understand what I call the shadow king, just study Zeus. But it's one of the interesting things to me, and we'll get into after that in all of these images that you get in Boland's book, there's no positive image of the king. See? There is none whatever there. See? And there's actually no positive image of the queen. This is what I mean when I say her work has been a pilot study. It's important to do Greek mythology. But if you're looking at Greek mythology for images of the mature feminine or the mature masculine, you're going to look a long time because it isn't there. See? It's not that these energies are not energies we have to deal with all the time as human beings. They are. And she's done a magnificent phenomenological job, and it's very practical. And if you haven't read both of her books, you're missing out on practical understanding of folks you live with, as well as yourself. But anyway, you don't get a very articulated image of the potentials that lie behind these articulated divine images. Let's get a few more images. Let's just get out of the Greek tradition now. Let's broaden it out. What about who? Apollo. What about Apollo? Apollo ought to be named here.
Why?
You know, well, what does Apollo do? Certainly Apollo is seen as wise, but what?
He drives the sun across the sky.
And now he's associated with the sun, so what is that probably about?
Light.
Light. Well, now it's associated with light, and maybe light and wisdom are the same, but maybe they aren't. See, illumination may include more than light, and it may not just be yang. I mean, it may be yang and yin. See, there may be some moist darkness in wisdom. But people do associate Apollo with wisdom. But now, what else about it? Let's get that sense of that Apollonian. What do we say? Apollonian. That is an Apollonian person. What are we saying about that person? Shoot straight arrows. What is he like? What is he likely to shoot a straight arrow at you about? well, to correct you, his ideas and so forth. What is he likely to frown at you about?
Apollo, looking at Apollo naked. I mean Aphrodite. No, I mean Artemis. I'll get it. Give me time.
Apollo doesn't really feel real good about anything very passionate. So if you start showing some passion, you better duck. See. Apollonian people that are ruled by that image are very suspicious of anything hot and moist and passionate. Do what? Apollo might write a wonderful book about music, but in terms of really being into music, that's not his major stock in trade. See? Yes. Hermes disarmed him with music. That is a sign that he wasn't very good at music. See, you always know what's in your shadow by what disarms you. See? I mean, if you are undone by something, that's a pretty good clue that you're not real great in that energy. If it makes you go unconscious and compulsive, then that's a pretty good sign that's an area you need a little work in, right? Because if you are fairly well developed in a given energy, you will have an aha and you will know the territory. And then if you start, for example, if you move out of the Apollo sector of your psyche, or the feminine counterpart of that, and, well, a practical example, if you really spend a lot of time in the Apollo part of your psyche, your sex life is going to be hell. It's going to be nothing. It's going to be academic. You're going to read books about it. You know, take courses on it. See? Read books about licking. See? But you don't have any valuation much of the sensuousness of life as long as you're in that. And see, this is something people, once you get a sense for the significance of this and these different territories in the psyche, then it makes you realize why it might be a good idea to study these maps of mythology. Because mythologies of the world are maps to these energies and these locations in your soul. And why would a woman want to study these masculine maps? Well, protection, one says. That's realistic. That is to say, you want to know something about the maps of the masculine soul so that you will know the beings that you're meeting, who these beings are, what they are likely about. Now, but that's the easy part to talk about. Let's talk a little bit about the animus here. Because you want to study these maps because that is the deepest structural elements in your own feminine psyche. And without a familiarity with this inner world geography, then your relationships with men in the outer world will be completely wrecked. Because you will be defenseless with some forms of the masculine out there because you don't know them in here. You will overvalue some because you undervalue them in your own soul. You will undervalue some because they are unconsciously overvalued in your soul. So in other words, it does not, here's one of the fundamental assumptions I want to come back to after our break. That is to say, you can't just maximize your knowledge of your own gender imagery. Because if you take that point of view, you are guaranteeing that you're going to idealize in a pathological way the other gender. Okay, let me finish it, then I'll run it by again, because it's a fundamental theoretical assumption that I think is critical now in our time. That is to say, if you major solely in understanding the gender imagery, your own gender imagery, that will guarantee that you idealize in a pathological way the other gender. Now let me finish it. Stay with me. When you idealize something unconsciously, it means that you both at the same time overvalue it and hate it. You follow that? That's a fundamental principle that I think rules in these areas. And after our break, I'm going to come back and I'm going to try to talk about how, and before we stop at least, I'm going to try to talk about why it is then that females must study and value masculine images of the divine and these energies, both for psychological purposes, relationship purposes, and for theological, constructive, symbolic spirituality purposes. Because it's not, these things are important, and vice versa. Okay. So, let me go back over that idealization thing. See, if it is unconscious in you, if you're not familiar, if you haven't gotten into your explorer mode and gone carefully through these inner world maps of the feminine and these inner world maps of the masculine, then there are going to be territories which are mystified, not mythological, which are mystified to you and which you are very naive about. When you're really naive about it and you can't feel it as a part of your own wiring and your own knowledge systems, then you will become extremely vulnerable to it. You'll become credulous, you will become naive, you will become vulnerable, and you will become hateful toward it. And so this gives us a kind of a principle by which we can figure out, if you're a male, you can say, wonder what parts of the pleroma of the feminine I am comfortable with, and which parts of the pleroma of the feminine I am not comfortable with. But since I'm not comfortable with it, I'm compulsively attracted to it. And I'm constantly getting in trouble with it in some way. And then we do the same thing. If I'm a woman, I ask myself, what parts, what territories in the inner geography of the feminine have I explored in my work on my anima? Those parts that I have not explored will be directly related to the compulsive relationships I enter into, to the enormity of the pain I have in my relationship with the other gender. The contrasexual unconscious, that's the animus in a woman, the anima in a male. If you have not explored that area, it will mean you will be unconscious in that area of relatedness to that gender. You will tend to be vulnerable to it, and you will tend to idealize it, and you will tend to hate it and try to destroy it in some way. So in other words, you will try to incorporate it, and you will try to destroy it. You will be full of ambivalence about that part of your soul. You follow that? Okay.
Does that all have to be worked out inwardly? I mean, if you work that out in relationships too, exploring new kinds of relationships.
Well, you know, she says, does that all have to be worked out inwardly, or can you work it out in relationships too? Now, that's a complicated, subtle, tricky question, isn't it? That sounds like that's coming from Hermes in there somewhere. It's a good question, though. It's a subtle question, and look at it this way. Let's just look at that. If it was worked out in outer relationships, we wouldn't be such a serial relationship society. See, that is, if it was really worked out. See, there's a word in psychoanalysis we call repetition compulsion. You know, after you wake up and you have had 14 failed relationships with the same man or the same woman, see, except different bodies. Same person in different bodies, different names. Then you figure something's going on. However, there is no way to work with the contrasexual without actual experiences of the other gender. So you're absolutely right. I mean, it's like it's both and. You cannot, if there's not increasing reflection on these impersonal beings in the persons you relate to. See, that's the genius in Jung. We got to get that. There are all these impersonal. See, remember, archetypes are not personal. They are nature. They're not humanly personal. And you've got to become aware so that when you meet someone and you feel this massive sort of an undertow like you get off of the Mexican coast, you know, and you feel your feet beginning to kind of go out toward, you know. Something ought to happen right there. One should say, which impersonal being have I just encountered? See? Because that's an archetypal experience. Fascinating by definition, right? Numinosity, fascination, loss of consciousness, compulsive behavior, wake up with a hangover of some kind of hangover. So do you follow that now? Now that applies that approach applies to males and females with regard to these images. And so when we're looking at these masculine images of the divine, what we're striving to do is to understand the hardwiring of the human soul. The human soul comes at its deepest levels with this full masculine and feminine pleroma. That's consistent with everything fundamental in Jung's thought. In fact, Jungian theorists have not done enough with his concept of the pleroma. Many people today sort of dismiss that as some of his Gnostic preoccupations. You know, that's just some of that crazy stuff in Jung. We're embarrassed about that. Let's get away from that, see. But actually, his discussions of the pleroma, in my view, are very important theoretically because it has to do with this rich surround of imagery that comes forth through the mythologies and comes forth through the religions. Now, we're going to take a break in just a minute, but think about what history and culture does to this pleroma. In other words, I will guarantee you that no particular culture ever had it together on this. Period. That is, there never was, the chalice and the blade to the contrary. There never was a culture that had this pleroma honored adequately. See? There is no evidence that a historian would respect that has ever existed in human history. And the Holocaust of human history in general, and specifically the Holocaust of the relationship of the genders, attest to that. And so it is our task now, in what is a new time, we may not be New Agers, but this is potentially a new time in which we can address what it would be like in terms of spirituality to seriously to try to honor the pleroma of this richness of images in the soul, both masculine and feminine. Now, after our break, I'm going to come back and tell you what I think the fundamental structures are, and I've talked to you about this before, and then say something about some practical implications. But let's take about 10-minute break. Okay. I want to mention this ongoing series of books on Jung and the world spiritual traditions that I'm series editor of. This is one of the volumes. There are about 10 volumes in the pipeline in this now, and we are going to be trying to make this in the next 20 years the major forum for dialogue between Jungian psychology and psychoanalysis and world spiritual traditions. And let me just read a few of the titles that have. The first one was the Carl Jung and Christian Spirituality, which I edited. The second volume to come out was one by Stephen Gallipo, Transforming Body and Soul, Therapeutic Wisdom in the Gospel, Healing Stories. And then this one is Jung and Christianity and Dialogue, Faith, Feminism, and Hermeneutics. So we've started with Christian tradition, and we will do other things through the years on Christianity. But the next volume, some of the next volumes are Self and Liberation, the Jungian Buddhist Dialogue, which I and Daniel Meckel, my managing editor, have edited. We plan a series of anthologies on all the major world spiritual traditions where we bring together the best essays we can find anywhere on the problems of relating Jungian thought to that tradition. And then we are planning monographs which take that deeper in relationship to particular topics and particular larger issues in each tradition. We also have some volumes planned relating Jung and particular philosophers. For example, this book, Individuation and the Absolute, is a book which will be coming out by Sean Kelly on Jung, Hegel, and the Science of Wholeness, relating Jung and Hegel. We hope that we will have books relating Jung and Hegel, Jung and Kant, Jung and Whitehead, and so forth, and other major philosophers. So for those of you that are interested in new physics and so forth, we have this book coming out called The Web of the Universe, Jung, the New Physics and Human Spirituality, which will be out soon, written by John Hitchcock, who's the author of a well-known book called Atoms, Snowflakes, and God. He's a physicist who is into Jung. And there are many others, but let me suggest that you look at this and that you stay familiar with this series as it develops. The other thing I want to just mention is that this system that we're talking about, this is the paperback of the King, Warrior, Magician, Lover volume, which I just got the first copies of. It will be out this summer in paperback. And the King volume, there are going to be 4 volumes, one on each of these patterns, published by William Morrow Press in the next probably 18 months to 2 years. The King volume will be out in February. So there's a whole lot of work. Then they're going to bring out the Warrior volume next and so forth until all 5 of these volumes will be available probably within the next 18 months. This is not, no, the Queen, there's no discussion of the female psyche in this. The King volume has a large section where we discuss the structural stuff that I'm going to present now. It's not presented as an elaboration of the female side of this, although I will, as I have time, talk about that more. As Bolin has done about the masculine psychology, I'll talk more about what I think about the structure of the feminine psyche as I have time to write. I mean, we have about, right now, there are about 6 different books that are in press that will be coming out before long, and we've got a bunch more planned, so it'll just be a matter of when I can get to it. I'm working on a book that relates this to psychopathology for psychotherapists. In that, I will have to lay out a lot of the way in which female and male psychopathology is different according to how I believe the psyche is structured somewhat differently, but in a parallel way. So, yes?
I've been commissioned by several people in Dallas to ask you, are you going to do any work in the future with the triangles in the feminine showing the shadow signs as you did with the puer and the...
You mean girl psychology?
Girl psychology, right.
I sure intend to. Yes, you know, Douglas Gillette and I really believe that well, I'll get into that now. That is, I, more than probably anyone else, really believe that there is a discernible crystalline structure that the psyche is modeled on that functions like a hologram, and that it's not that difficult to understand it. Once you begin to look at the octahedron as a geometric model for this stuff, and you begin to look at all the research from different psychological theories, and you begin to look at the cross-cultural research, and you'll begin to see how much enormous evidence supports that this octahedral model that Jung intuited. You see, the thing that I'm going to be laying out in this King volume with Douglas, and also in this little monograph. I've got a little technical monograph I'm trying to get finished. It's going to be a very limited edition, but it's going to be called The Magician and the Analyst, Ritual, Sacred Space, and Psychotherapy. I will lay out the way in which this, I really believe that I have stumbled into decoding the diamond body, that is, to decoding the structure of the self that Jung got in volume 9.1 or 9.2, Ion, 9.2. If you look at those diagrams in there where Jung talks about the structure of the self, he shows you a series of octahedral shaped diagrams. And various Jungians, from Jung himself to John Layard in the book The Celtic Quest, and James Hall in the recent book that Murray Stein has brought out on liminality and transitional phenomena in therapy, various Jungians have struggled with this, trying to decode this octahedral shape, taking Jung seriously, that Jung must know something here. There's some reason he's emphasizing this. But the other treatments of this, in my view, have been mystified and sort of mythical in themselves, and have not really had much clinical significance. And that's why they haven't been picked up by anybody, because they can't be demonstrated as having much clinical significance.
James Hall, of course, has talked to us for years about iron.
Yes.
So he's got a big...
Oh, James Hall, if you look at that essay he did, in this new book by, James Hall and Murray Stein and I and a bunch of people went down to Mexico and had this conference on liminality and analysis some years ago, and this is the proceedings of that, and James was laying this stuff out. And I'm just offering this interpretation as what I think that octahedral shape is, and right. Yes, right. Well, this stuff that's coming out now will give you the structure. Now you can extrapolate, and basically, I think that the 4 powers, the 4 energies, are fundamentally the same in males and females. They mediate differently, and they historically have manifested differently. But in terms of understanding what the energies are for, I think that it's very easy for women to extrapolate. I will say what I think about it later, but I think it will be easy for people to extrapolate the nuances of the feminine experience of these energies. But let me get into that right quickly now. Many of you have heard me talk about this before. And remember, I'm not going to go into the clinical dimensions here. I'm not going to be able to talk about shadow. If you look in this paperback, you get an initial look at the different, these triangles that we present. You know, I've had a lot of people that couldn't get, apparently the right brain stuff is a little weak, and they weren't able to get that when we talk about these triangles here that have the bipolar shadow designated with each verse, we're not talking about triangles, we're talking about faces of pyramids. And the bipolar shadow, that is to say, we really believe you can understand that Jung was right that you have to deal with the shadow before you deal with the contrasexual, because the shadow is not as deep in the psyche as the contrasexual. The shadow, we think, is along here. There's a bipolar tension here. For those of you that have studied Hegel, thesis, antithesis, synthesis. Thesis, antithesis, synthesis. Thesis, antithesis, synthesis. And that Hegel was seeing some things. He wasn't just making that up. He was intuiting structural elements in the human soul. And but that your contrasexual is much deeper in your unconscious, and you're going to have more trouble with it than you're going to have. It's bad enough to deal with the shadow, which is here, but then look at what you got to deal with next. And Jung was very clear that working with the contrasexual is much harder than working with the shadow. And I think there's a structural base, an actual, literally, biological, genetic, structural basis for that. I don't think that's accidental or just a nice idea. I believe that this is in biograms that function very likely like holograms that we can see, where you can, in fact, one of my dreams is that before long I'll be able to have a hologram so I can stand up here when I'm talking and say, and if you'd like to, and I push my button and one appears, Falk, so that you can get out here and walk around the diamond body. See? Well, there are a lot of people that actually can do it, only it's not cheap. I gotta sell some books before I'm going to be able to do that. Well, I've got some models that have been made of this thing, and it helps to hold it in your hand, because then you can see how the very likely, since evolution tends to be economical in this way of holding codes together in the coding and the DNA coding and other kinds of coding, if you hold this model up, you'll see that the king and queen are on one face, consistently on one face of this thing, and the warriors are on one face, and so forth. But if you look down from either end, there's only one asymmetrical structure. The king and queen this is alike, but the asymmetry is in that axis, the relative comfort with aggression and intimacy. See, Mars, Aphrodite. And so what I'm suggesting is, and I know it sounds a bit grandiose, but you know, I'm trying to befriend my grandiosity. Some people say I've married it, you know. But I really believe that the enormous scientific evidence about the asymmetry of males and females on this, I do not for one moment think it's just cultural. I think culture has taken this asymmetry, this built into the deep structure, and rather than doing what it should do, that is compensating and helping us work with the things that are more difficult for us and develop them sooner, consolidate them sooner, become more comfortable with what's harder for us as a gender, culture exacerbates the difference. And so culture historically has said, males tend to really get into that aggression energy. Culture has tended to say aggression is masculine. It's a masculine province. And eros, or love and intimacy, is feminine. It's a feminine province. I totally disagree with that business. That is a regressive, archaic, demonic reading of gender. And I think that what we have to understand that these are all territories within the psyche, but what we also, I believe, and I'm willing to stand on this and defend it against all comers, that there is an asymmetry in the hardwiring on what it is easier for one to do on this axis, the warrior-lover axis. And the reason I'm willing to stand and defend it is that all the evidence is on my side. Biosocial evidence, historical evidence, cultural evidence, that males don't do too well getting this lover energy into any kind of mature integration, and females don't do too well in getting this aggression energy into a mature, consolidated integration. Now, does that mean we never can? I totally disagree with that. I think we can do better on this, you see. So let me just lay out just briefly now, if what I'm suggesting to you is this is the structural hardwiring that Buddhists talk about as the diamond body. There was a reason they talked about diamond body. They weren't, the Tibetan Buddhists were not just making all that up. And this is the structure that is behind the quaternio and the double quaternio, and the reason for Jung's fascination with it. And so when we talk, and Monday I'm going to be talking about creation and selfhood, and I'm going to be showing how this preoccupation with quadration in the context of creation, the formation of the center, is related to the formation of self, and I'm going to elaborate this a lot more. But in any case, very briefly, and it's all elaborated in here to some degree, and will be further elaborated in these other books, I like to suggest, now, archetypes can be many things. You know, if I've got my Whiteheadian philosopher hat on, I can talk about archetypes and concrescence and blah, blah, blah in terms of the cosmic epochs and blah, blah, blah. And I might be right about some of that. And I might be right to talk about the spiritual dimensions of the archetypes and blah, 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 and we can talk about the implications of that today. But right now I'm just speaking as a psychoanalytic scientist. And so when I speak of an archetype from that point of view, I'm talking about a program, in my view, a biogram. The archetype probably is a lot more than that, if you talk about it philosophically, metaphysically, theologically. So what I'm saying does not conflict with that at all. It's just saying that at least I believe it's a biogram. And I'm using biogram in the way that Lionel Tiger uses it in his book Men in Groups, and the way the contemporary ethologist and sociobiologists use it. So it's a, yes?
Excuse me. I
Yes.
just wanted to ask, would the archetype be considered like from the unconscious or the collective unconscious or the primordial?
Yes, let me recommend a book for you to look at that will work with this whole idea to try to get a handle on archetype the way I would use it. Not the way everybody else uses it, but the way I would use it, would be to look at Anthony Stevens' work and his book, Archetypes, A Natural History of the Self. Now, I think Anthony Stevens comes to some questionable conclusions about the implications of these things. See, one of the things you've got to be aware of, and I want to emphasize this. You can come to all sorts of conclusions, political and ethical conclusions, based on particular biological views of the human. And there are a lot of people today that are afraid that to look at biological influences on behavior will end up being sexist and racist in the worst degree. It has been that way in history. Does it have to be that way? My approach to this is 180 degrees away from that. That is to say, I don't think you can be responsible morally and ethically and politically if you do not face the inequities in different axes that are in our hardwiring. That what we have to do in our cultural, political, ethical, and religious functioning is to compensate and balance and facilitate wholeness, which takes into consideration these deep structures. Now, there'll be a lot of people, I'm going to be widely vilified because of what I'm suggesting about these things by people who are afraid that anybody that thinks biology, that there are biological differences, is going to use it politically against people. And it's good to be concerned about that. But the evidence, the scientific evidence about gender differences in biology and so forth is mounting rapidly. And very soon, there's not going to be any argument about this because the scientific evidence is mounting so rapidly now. We're going to have a book coming out about that probably before long. But we have to look at it. What are the behavioral implications of this, and then what do we do about it? See? Okay. Now let me go on through this quickly. Let me just lay this out before we get into question and discussion about this. We only have about 35 more minutes. Now we're talking about masculine and feminine images of the divine. I'm a Jungian psychoanalyst. What is my take on this? These images of the divine didn't just happen. Neither the masculine ones nor the feminine ones. The ancient Egyptians had a creation myth in which at the creation, when the original egg broke, out of that egg came 4 couples. See? Some people have said of me, from other perspectives in thought today, that because I believe there's an archetypal self, that makes me a monotheist. Well, that's kind of funny. I thought they were going to be calling me an octotheist. Because if I am anything, I'm an octotheist, not a monotheist. Because I believe there are 8 divine configurations, if you want to say realities, if you want to say personages, if you want to say that the divine is in fact a community of 4 couples, then I'm going to say, okay.
One cosmic egg.
One cosmic egg, 4 couples. And it's very fascinating to me. You can play with this and have a good time if you got a sense of humor. Have you been reading about the planned Mars mission? Have you been reading about how they would like to staff the Mars mission? 4 couples. Isn't that interesting? Now why 4 couples? Is that a scientific decision? I would argue, playfully, they're into a fantasy about what this trip is going to be. They're into a mythic fantasy about it, and they have unlimited opportunities to choose to structure it the way they want to. So 4 couples. We're back to Egypt again. Might be a good idea, but it'd be interesting to study what happens between those 4 couples. Okay, but let me run through this quickly. That is, you study the history of religion. If you just study Judeo-Christian traditions, the ancient traditions, if you follow Judeo-Christian Islamic, we need to start there since we ought to deal with patriarchy here. Then you're going to see in the biblical tradition, continued all the way through the Quran, enormous emphasis on these quadrants, king and warrior quadrants. That is in the tradition, not in the current theological seminaries. A lot of the current mainline theological seminaries wouldn't know what to do with a king image if it hit them in the face. See? But in the tradition, in the scriptural traditions, it's heavy king warrior with some lover magician stuff. But when people are talking, when people today are looking at what they call patriarchal spirituality, and working with scriptures, what you're hearing them work with a lot, they're not as antagonistic toward this part of the male psyche. It's this part of the male psyche in those traditions that really worry them, rightfully so, in the way it's worked out historically, yeah.
That's interesting. When you say those times the king warrior had a certain predominance. Today, the magician, the lover, the reverse has predominance. How has that developed? I mean, has that kind of slid around like that? Was it just a reverse flip over?
You can't. The comment and the question is that I'm saying that in the patriarchal traditions, the religions of the book, particularly the king and the warrior material, has been highlighted, and that she's suggesting that that's changed a lot today. Of course, that's a judgment. I think and it's an important question. That's a very complicated question about what happened. That in contemporary circles there's less emphasis on that. Well, you know. There is in intellectual circles a tremendous distrust of king and warrior energy everywhere. Now, my suggestion on that is right, because people in academic situations tend to be coming out of the magician. They don't like lover energy any more than they like king and warrior energy. See. And but if you want to see somebody that's suspicious of king and warrior energy, it's your academic intellectual, because the academic intellectual compulsively tends. Now I'm talking about my own folks now, so I'm not talking out of school here. And psychotherapists tend to be in the same archetypal configuration. We tend to be in the magician much more than anything else, and everything else tends to be in our shadow. So this is why professors and psychotherapists think they ought to be able to get away with sexually abusing their clients and their students. Why is that? Well, because that shadow lover is very shadowy, not very well integrated, and tends to pop up in these supposedly disembodied relationships. You know, the magician energy is very disembodied, by definition. In fact, those people that, here's for our day today, people that want to say, we're going to get beyond the sex of God and the goddess. I know who's talking there. It's either a male magician or a female magician. Because somebody speaking out of the magician archetype has no grasp of genitals at all. Wouldn't recognize them, and sure as hell wouldn't know what to do with them. So when you're in that, you know, it's like, we don't need these genitals in our theology. We can get beyond all that. Of course, when their shadow acts out, the genitals all of a sudden come back, right? Not in a very constructive way, but...
make them dean in their shadow king.
Right. Well, I mean, we don't want to leave out all these power issues that in the power shadow of anybody that's in the magician. So here's my first recommendation. When you're listening to anybody talk about these things, these issues, always ask yourself, well, now, I wonder what quadrant of the soul. See, I assume fundamentally your soul is quadrated in terms of your conscious functioning, in terms of your engendered self. And so is your contrasexual. We'll assume that most of us, when we speak out of our engendered self. Some folks speak out of their contrasexual anima or animus. That's true. But let's just assume for our purposes that someone is coming before you and they're speaking out of their engendered self. Well, then you listen and you try to hear the voices that are coming and what space it sounds like, what geography, what state of the psyche. Is this the state of the king, the state of the warrior, the state of the magician, or the state of the lover? If you study this stuff, if you study the psychoanalysis of space, you will notice that a voice coming from here doesn't sound like a voice coming from here. They don't have the same attitudes toward time. They don't have the same attitudes toward the body. They don't have the same attitudes toward the future. They don't have the same attitudes toward boundaries. They don't have the same attitudes toward relationship. They don't have the same attitudes about what is important in any way. And so, if you are speaking out of this, you're going to be real aggressively into power, organization, and control issues. Now, from my point of view, speaking as the Pope, I'm just doing it for your own good. This is for your own good. Put those genitals away, except when I say you should use them. And it's really for your own good.
The soul is good.
Huh?
The soul is good.
Yeah, but it's your soul, and I'm Father, I'm the universal Father, and that reads King in the archetypes, Papa. And I'm not being oppressive or tyrannical. I am just telling you what's good for you. And it's my job to create cosmos, universal order according to divine law. That's what that thing does. That's also what that thing does. And when you listen to somebody who has got a long agenda for how you're going to behave and how you're going to fit in with everybody else, and it tends to be structured along political power issues and doesn't seem to value any of these other spaces in your soul, then you know who's talking. And you know who's talking if it's over here. We say, they talk about, some of these people, I don't believe there's a mother archetype. A lot of my Jungian friends get upset with me about, oh yeah, there's a mother archetype, yeah. I think the archetype is the queen, and mothering goes on under that. Except I think the queen is far more than the mother, and the king is far more than the father. That I may be wrong about that. I doubt it, but well, maybe. But now look, if somebody is, if you hear somebody talking and they sound like they want to fight, see, and they sound like the world is divided into us and them, and we are good and we are the servants of cosmos and right order, and they are bad and they are the servants of chaos and everything bad, then you got a clue. This person is splitting. This person splits the whole world into opposing camps and sees no way for reconciliation, and the only alternative is conflict. And when you hear that, you got a clue about where that person is standing. Because if you're standing in this space, and folks, we all stand in this space, consciously or unconsciously. I'm so amused. I'm not very amused at this, but I try to be amused at this when these nice folks attack me for saying, well, you know, I just think we need more is all this into this warrior stuff, and I just think we need to get out of this warrior stuff. And I think there'll come a time we don't have this warrior. We just get rid of this, and more is really betraying. Blah, 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 blah. Again, never say this to my face. They usually say it to my back. And I'm always amused at this. I say, they don't have a sword, but they got a nice dagger. You see? This thing doesn't go away. You either got a sword or you got a dagger. And you notice who's the ones that stick it in your back. The ones that stick it in your back, that's warrior energy. It isn't very mature warrior energy. It isn't very developed warrior energy. It sure as hell is not stewarded warrior energy, but it's warrior energy. And you will notice when somebody is coming on at you, and you can see the tracers go by your left ear and the tracers go by your right ear, but they're coming at you from a pacifist point of view, trying to get rid of this warrior energy. And of course, they're totally slandering your soul, telling you you're not a human, you're a demon, and you really ought to be banished from the face of the earth. But we're doing this from a peaceful point of view. See? Well, that's warrior energy. We've all got it. The best thing to do is just assume there is no such thing as a disarmed person. They're all armed. The only ones that claim to be disarmed are the ones with the daggers. And they're going to get you in your back. Yeah. How do you handle it? Badly, usually. Most of us handle this badly. I'm serious. That's true. The history of the human species is the history of our handling this badly. You know, you got to have a terrible, dark sense of humor about this, right? Because it's like I like to say, males, we males, we in our hardwiring, we have this propensity to be able to get this warrior stuff online. That's the first thing that really comes online. Pow! When you get to an adolescent male, I've got scientific proof about this in all our cities. If you hadn't seen Boys in the Hood, you need to go see that. We got this warrior energy. And I like to say, well, and males, it's easier for males to get this stuff online than it is for females and get it integrated. And then I say, maybe easier, but I mean, we have totally botched it throughout all of history. I mean, so just because it's maybe statistically a little bit easier for us to get the male to get the warrior energy integrated, our track record is dismal. So I mean, let's not exaggerate the degrees of difficulty here. See, I mean the degrees of the asymmetry. I believe there is an asymmetry, but frankly, neither gender has done great on integrating either of these. If they had, Earth might be fair. But we look at our condition and we see how well we've done in individuation in both genders. Yeah, somebody had their hand up back here. Yeah.
Would that be mishandling it? Would that be inflation? In other words, reject on the
You got it. He says, would mishandling it, is that a way of talking about inflation? I would say you're absolutely right. That's what Jung would call this. It's inflation of some kind. One is either inflated positively or one is inflated negatively. And depression is a negative inflation. Overt arrogance is a positive inflation. But it's inflation of archetypal energies in some case. Okay, so what to do in terms of looking at masculine images is to look historically at what has typically been in history as we know it from our studies. There has been a lot more imagery that is survived around these masculine images, although there is a good bit of the shaman images of God, Jesus the magician. You see that. You see Jesus, lover of my soul. And all the evangelical gospel hymns that emphasize God as love present this image of God, the divine lover. And of course, the other traditions are replete with this. If you look at Krishna in the Hindu tradition, Krishna is a god who occupies what spaces basically? Lover and magician. Krishna, I mean, he's got his flute and comes around at night when the husbands are asleep. Oh, that flute. All the ladies come out at night and dance with him. Yeah.
Sorry about this, but I'm really intrigued with this, but I've been doing a lot of thinking about Christianity, and I don't mean to speak against Christianity, but I wonder...
Oh, that's okay.
If there's an inbuilt contradiction, I really had this question a long time, that in fact what we're seeing here is a contradiction between...
Speak a little louder, please.
Oh, I'm sorry. A high confession of love and changing with love and caring, and yet what seems to be dominant in the presentation or proclamation is the negative king warrior, who is the angry warrior. And I just wonder about so many ministers burning out and people losing interest in Christianity.
Well, you could give a lot of lectures on that topic. What he was talking about, for those of you listening to the tape, is Christianity's profession of love and the history of a sort of shadow king, warrior domination and persecution, etc. I think you can elaborate that extensively because, see, this is the rule. Look, I really believe that if you don't get one of the quarters up front, you're going to get it in the back. And so if you've got someone who depreciates sexuality, for example, I won't call any names, or wants to reduce it to a king or queen image of sexuality, there is some sexual shadow going on here. It's no accident that so many priests who are trying to live a life attitude toward sexuality out of this king thing have a kind of shadow lover stuff come in the back door. Because my assumption here is either you get it on the top of the table and you relate to it honestly with valuation and stewardship, or it's going to come in the back door. And it's going to create chaos. And it's going to have all kinds of mischief that you will blame on somebody else. See? Now, I believe that's built in structurally. And so I think we see our situation. I mean, just think about if you think this way, think about not only think about the radical diagnosis of the history of human spirituality, which is tended to follow, as we see in the Gods in Every Man book. If we study the Gods in Every Man book, this is a sort of a psychopathology of human spirituality. That is, there are not much images of balance there. You would not know there was a healthy king or queen by looking at Greek mythology. And if you study most of the history of human mythology with regard to images of the divine, it's awfully hard to find images of the masculine or the feminine who are very whole and balanced. I think this is the reason. I think the reason is that history and families and traditions, ethnic traditions, and the accidental warp and woof of history will access different aspects and balances of these energies as appropriate to that, or not appropriate, inappropriate to that time. And what you get is all this wobbling back and forth over the four quarters. You know, kind of like a top, you know, that's about to run down. You get throughout history, you get this kind of wobbling around here, not any kind of shape to it. See, let me just say a couple of images from history of mythology and religion. If you study, I'll talk more about this Monday, but if you study, as I've been doing, the history of ancient cities, I think they are models of this self-structure. Pre-modern, primordial city image. The polis. The polis, I believe, is actually an image of the self. And, for example, if you study the ancient African Yoruba tribe, and you look at an image of their city, you have four quarters of the city. It's clearly divided into four quarters. There is a chief that rules over each of the quarters. In other words, that's a kind of a powerful image. That is, there in one way of looking at it, there's not just one crown, there are four crowns. And they got to cooperate. Another image is in the Chinese history, where the emperor lived in the holy city, and through the four quarters of the year, there were four quarters of his palace. And so the palace is an image of the world, the city, the self. And through the year, according to the astrological calendar, he lived in one quarter. And he carefully lived through the 4 quarters. And if you study this sort of thing, you find that the dancing of the 4 quarters is a primordial mythical image of wholeness, usually done by the sacred king in the records that we have. My argument would be that there's also a queen who dances the 4 quarters, and that when we get any kind of human development, culturally, politically, socially, spiritually, religiously, that is worthy of our species, we will see more clearly that there really is a queen that dances the 4 quarters, provides for this image of wholeness as a mature woman, just as there's a king who dances the 4 quarters and provides an image of wholeness spiritually and psychologically and culturally and politically and ethically for the male. So now let me stop. Let me just summarize that now. So what I'm suggesting to you is, in terms of images of masculine spirituality, history has played to the tendency of males who have the greatest firepower, the greatest ease with the arms race. That's a male thing, an immature male thing, I might add. Kind of fixation on the development of armament. They've been good at that throughout history. And since they have majored in that, in sort of the immature warrior energy, they, of course, never got the king energy together in a generative way, consistently. Spots here, spots there. But so, with all that firepower and the propensity to be a shadow king, we got human history. And when they've got all that firepower, it's very hard to oppose it. My argument is, that's why working with men today in the context of all the work that's being done with men is so important. Because men are always going to be better at arms races. And they're going to always be quicker to kill you. And they're going to always be more ready to use violence to impose their will. And so if you don't help men mature, in my view, get all this stuff online in a more mature way, then we're just going to see a continuation of history as it has been until the improvement in armaments gives the world back to the roaches. See? Yeah, the roaches are real hardy. So in other words, though, and so what is the thing? Well, you see, here's another little principle that you can use. Do women have any culpability in the male tendency to just stay locked in this thing? See? Is there any female shadow? You think about this in terms of Maria Louise von Franz's book on projection and recollection. If my partner is not individuating in the areas which I am compulsive in, then I will tend to be encouraged by that relationship, codependency, to continue in my regressive dominance of that compulsive form of energy. You follow that? So we have a moral responsibility to each other as males and females of our species to dance the 4 quarters without asking anybody for permission and without apologizing for it. We must dance the 4 quarters, because if we do not, then we seduce the other gender into their own propensity for demonic formations. Do you follow what I'm saying there? If I do not develop wholeness, then I am unconsciously seducing my relationships, the people I relate to, both male and female. into continuing their patterns of imbalance. So there's no such thing as a psychology that's not a moral psychology. Anybody that tells you that there's a value-free psychology, you just simply know that they hadn't had much education, because all psychology has moral implications. Now let me stop there. We've got a few minutes. Let me take some questions. I know this is confusing. Julia will straighten all this out this afternoon. Promise you. Yeah, back here.
Is there a suggestion that recorded history is somehow recorded the projected shadow of our business as human beings, particularly because of what you said about the myths that come up, the Greek myths, which don't carry any positive side.
Yeah. Well, what I'm saying about recorded history, there's a lot to be seen. See, we don't know what really happened. And feminist theoreticians have constantly pointed this out. Patriarchy, with all that firepower, controlled what books and stories, for the most part, got allowed to survive. Now, how did that happen? Well, look, I'm honest about this, and I don't consider this male bashing. I don't think it's male bashing to say that males have been acting out with their aggression a lot in boy psychology, boy warriors. I call them monster boys. And if you study a little of this history, who has had all this firepower? It's been males. And they've ones that went in there and burned the libraries at Alexandria. And they're the ones that went in there and destroyed what records existed of the stuff that didn't get buried in the caves that Gimbutas is bringing out. Well, now, so what we've got in our historical record, you can't assume that's all that happened. So there may have been some society somewhere that was a golden age. We just don't have any evidence of it. You follow what I'm saying? And so what I'm saying, but I'm not a historian in that sense. I'm just saying, in a sense, I look at this like I look at if you were to come to me for analysis. I don't really care that much how you got warped. It's interesting to me. I mean, I'm interested in how you got warped. But I'm a lot more interested in seeing you bloom in a kind of a wholeness. And so what it takes to get you to bloom, you can learn how to bloom without understanding how you got warped. See, I differ from a lot of people on that. See?
If I fixate on how I got warped,
You're likely to not get your mind on blooming, right? See, when the Buddhists the Buddhists know so much stuff. I really didn't get back into interest in Buddhism until recent years, when I realized they had all this stuff in this diamond body thing. But that image of the lotus, see, that's the lotus. And look at the image they utilize there. See, when you really get that sense of wholeness, it's not a metallic killer image. There's a certain delicacy and wondrous delicacy that integrates the feminine. See, in fact, I would say that integrates the lover energy in a very consolidated way in that lotus image. Yeah.
Two things. One, when you talk about the Buddhist and the diamond body. Earlier,
Speak up just a little bit so everybody can hear you.
Two questions. One, when you talk about the Buddhist and the diamond body, even earlier I had remembered when I had read about the Australian myths that the shaman, when he was initiation and they completed this, that their internal guts and everything turned to crystals. It was crystallized inside. They had
I didn't know
other things
that.
stuck in there too, but I mean, along with it was these crystals and
Yeah.
those stones that they carry, the crystals
Yeah.
and stuff.
Yes.
They sort of are symbolic
Yes.
of that, and I had a feeling that the more of these they so-called had, the more they could. It was more symbolic of their experiences in the inner world and walking on those borders there.
You'll have to show me. She's talking about something she's read about shamans when they are transformed, have crystals or stones that replace their intestines.
And everything, yeah.
It's very interesting. If you really believe there is a geometry to the human self structure that is a code for the psychological and kind of spiritual dynamics that parallels to the code for DNA for physical things. If you believe that, and you take a scientific attitude and you start looking at other kinds of evidence, then you start looking for other images of these crystalline structures and preoccupations with them. I'm not going to mention, of course, the fact that 50 cultures built pyramids at a certain time in history. See? And I'm not going to mention that in the ancient tribe, African tribe of the Dogon, in their mythology of the arrival of the gods and the goddesses at the beginning of time, that the craft that they arrived in was an octahedral craft. Didn't know that till somebody that specialized in African mythology and religion pointed it out to me. In fact, this person said that if you go to the area in Africa where the Dogon tribe has been dominant and you dig in the fields, you will often find these octahedral ritual objects which were used by them in their spirituality. So I mean, you can elaborate all this. In fact, I've gotten where I'd love to talk to some geometrists. You know, I mean, the people that are geometers. But it's like this whole, if you feel disempowered and you feel weak, you're giving away your king or queen in a projected form. And this is at the heart of individuation. And we can stop with this. It's like one of the gifts that Jungian thought brings to us as human beings, as a species, is to understand that these images of the divine, these images of the powers, these numinous powers, they may be many other things, depending on what you're doing, but at least they are images of enormous potentials of the human. And so when you're looking at these images of the divine from a psychological point of view, we hope that you will raise your view of the human and what we are capable of, and how much potential for glorious, magnificent living here in this world that we have in our hardwiring. If we can just get the religious leaders and the political leaders to help us develop a culture and a society which will help us to develop into what we are. You know, people, tease me about being an optimist. I'm not an optimist at all, but I really believe that our species, I don't think I'm being so unreasonable to say what we ought to do is try to develop the potential of our species. I mean, is that such a radical idea? I don't really think so. I just think we have to think about what we need to develop to elicit these potentials that we have in our codes toward wholeness. I've got to stop there because you have to eat. Thank you very much. You've been a great group.